morning and welcome back to the Plant-Based Asia Summit. I'm Angie, and this morning we are welcomed by a woman who is supporting and growing the world's most compelling food companies and alternative proteins. Dr. Dalal AlGhawas is the program director at Big Idea Ventures, a venture capital firm which invests in future food technologies in the alternative protein ecosystem. Now, Dr. Dalal has helped to establish the first food technology accelerator program in Hong Kong and has worked with over 50 global technology startups with special focus on plant-based protein alternatives, cellular agriculture, sustainability, smart kitchen equipment, medtech, and software. She holds a Doctor of Philosophy, Food Science, and Food Biotechnology from the University of Hong Kong. Welcome, Dr. Dalal. It's such an honor to have you here with us this morning.
Thank you. The honor is all mine. Thanks for having me.
Well, this morning you are going to be presenting on the investment landscape for plant-based proteins and the future of food, which is truly a captivating space. Afterwards, time permitting, we'll continue with some Q&A. But without further ado, Dr. Dalal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. All right, let me share my screen. Can you all see my screen? Okay, let me present mode. Okay, just let me know if you can see it. All right, perfect. All right, so, hi everyone. Thank you all for tuning in. It's a pleasure to be part of the Plant-Based Asia Summit. And thank you, for having me here. I'm going to really, dive in deep about this ecosystem that we're, investing in, tell you a little about some of the, the food trends, about like novel proteins, and some of the challenges that we're facing with regards to formulation, food processing, as well as the nutrition. So just to get us kick-started, I'll tell you a little bit about Big Idea Ventures, and maybe you're all curious, why would an investment firm be interested in alternative protein? So we're quite new. We were established back in 2019 by a gentleman named Andrew Ive, the gentleman here on the right. So what we really saw as an opportunity was within the food technology investment space was the rise of alternative proteins. And the rise of this with regards to the need from, let's say, consumers to have, let's say, replacements to animal products. There was also the need from governments, let's say, policymakers, to be able to diversify their products that were available to their consumers. So especially when it comes to, let's say, meat demand, it's on the rise everywhere in the world, but especially in Asia Pacific. So it's important that, not just, for governments to increase, let's say, animal husbandry, but it's really important to find alternatives that are, of course, more sustainable, more nutritious. And, what's great to see is there are synergies between government and policymakers, as well as consumers that are really looking for these healthier, more sustainable choices. And what we tried to do when we started our investment firm is make sure that we were backed by very strategic partners and investors, so that we could combine both capital as well as partnership to support the world's best food technology companies in the alternative protein ecosystem. So what you can see here on the slide is we're backed by some of the leading food corporates in the space, and funny enough, even by corporates that are traditional, let's say, animal meat producers. But the point is there's a transformation even within the industry to innovate and to move away from animal, livestock and animal husbandry. So, we're very proud to have, let's say, closed our first fund, the New Protein Fund, at $50 million US. And we have over 50 companies, funny enough, within our investment portfolio. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about that as well. In terms of the companies that we invest in, it can range from, everything like from the, let's say, the plant-based space. So companies producing plant-based, let's say, analogs to everything, to meat, dairy, seafood, even eggs, even snacks. We then have, the other side, which is the cell-based, biotechnology-based technologies that are, let's say, using traditional practices either from, medicine, biomedical sciences, biotechnology, or even biopharmaceuticals, and reinventing foods away from, where we would traditionally see them. And then we have, also ecosystem drivers, and these would be, let's say, support systems to both the plant-based and the cell-based industries to provide innovative technologies, ingredients, to, of course, improve efficiency, either through cost or production processes. So, this is who we are and what we do. But again, I want to also draw a deeper picture about some of the consumer trends, especially in Asia Pacific, since, we do have a lot of metric and data about, Europe and the US, but Asia is also quite special. So I'm going to tell you a bit about this. So, as we mentioned, the opportunity is there. The alternative protein market is rising, and especially in Asia, the demand for meat is going to grow by 78% by the year 2050. That's because of the rise in population, as well as the growing affluence in society. So funny enough, by the year 2030, at least 2/3 of, let's say, the middle class will actually be in Asia Pacific. And of course, with that growing affluence, consumers do want to be decadent. They want to have the best food. And, for now, that has been animal products. But in the future, we want to make sure that these can also be replaced by the plant-based or even the cell-based space. And, having said that, of course, there are a lot of challenges, still, yet to be, faced. We have to find, ways that we can produce these foods more sustainably, and at the same time, make sure governments are able to have food self-sufficiency and food security for their populations. So, a lot of things have happened recently to really push the alternative protein ecosystem. The first thing would be, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has disrupted supply chains globally. So especially for very small countries like Singapore that heavily rely on food imports, I think the latest figures showed that 90% of food is imported in Singapore. So you can imagine when you have these global disruptions, what that might happen for any country, especially very small countries that don't have any, let's say, agricultural land or land for food manufacturing. The second thing, as we mentioned, is Asia's demand for protein is soon going to outpace supply, and that's everywhere, including China, some of these very large countries. So, a lot of governments are concerned, and, you can see that, of course, the food companies want to be able to provide alternatives, but there's also a stimulus from policymakers to make sure that they can also encourage this movement. So the alternative protein market is expected to grow to 140 billion in the next 10 years. Which is, quite exciting because you can see a lot of companies jumping out on a space. And when we look at consumer trends, of course, because of all, let's say, the geopolitical and supply chain issues, you also have, the conscious consumer, which is on the rise. And, this is very much alive in Asia, right? And following some of the more global trends that we're seeing that, maybe peaked in Europe and the US, but really in Asia, we have, let's say, a very long, let's say, traditional legacy of veganism through, let's say, religious, as well as, religious, let's say, considerations, in both, let's say, the Asia as well as the South Asian markets. And you can see now this revival of this movement, and it's becoming, let's say, more hip and trendy, becoming mainstream, and, becoming more, let's say, there's more promotion within different population groups. So, people are very curious to try it. Hence, there's a lot of, let's say, Google searches about this movement. On the other side, what we're seeing is there are a lot of, let's say, government and, let's say, non-governmental think tanks that are popping up in this region to really support policymakers, to support innovators in the space. So I have to really mention that, the Good Food Institute actually have their own department here in Asia Pacific, as well as a private think tank in China to support this movement. And you also have locally homegrown, let's say, alliances such as the China Plant-Based Food Alliance, which is really supporting not only, let's say, the movement in terms of consumer awareness, but also impacting regulators on the ground. So they're constantly improving and implementing novel food applications for plant-based foods in China, which is, really, really excellent to see that it's becoming full circle and really, let's say, entering the mainstream. And I won't touch on this so much, but I'm sure you're all pretty much aware that for consumers, of course, let's say the health risks associated with high meat consumption are now becoming more apparent. Everything from developing chronic diseases, antibiotic resistance, virus zoonosis, as well as food allergies. And the environmental impact that the animal livestock has on the impact that animal livestock has on the environment is also an issue. And when we look at food, let's say efficiency, something to note is the feed to food ratio. So a lot of, let's say, policymakers are saying, okay, if you require so much feed and so much input to feed an animal, why don't we just use the feed and feed humans instead? I know, and we're really happy to see that some of our companies are also using some of these strategies by taking some of the we would classify them as waste byproducts from the agricultural space that would traditionally be fed to livestock and to animals, but rather now you can see a lot of innovators are retransforming it into food that we can eat, and that has the same textural properties as like chicken or other types of animal products. And the other, let's say, consumer trend to note as well is there's tied to sort of the health risk associated with heavy meat consumption. This is also tapping onto the growing, let's say, risk of chronic diseases in Asia Pacific, as well as the rise of health and wellness, let's say, investments and health and wellness, let's say, consumer habits. So that's is expected to grow quite steadily within the next few years, all over Southeast Asia as well as Northeast Asia. And we can really see that alternative proteins have now become part and parcel with these healthy foods in let's say, in combination with a healthy diet and lifestyle. So again, we got into this space because there's an investment opportunity, right? At the end of the day, we have to make returns. We are not a nonprofit, but we really want to show that we are impact investors because we do want to support sustainable food practices. And let's say that will lead to food security, that will lead to better health and nutrition, and of course that will lead to sustainable agricultural practices. So I'm going to just show you how luckily we are in a position where it's so easy for us because we can do all of that. And I would always encourage other investors that it's now is the best time. If you want to invest in sustainability, there are so many opportunities. So when you look at, let's say the growth of the alternative protein market, especially in China, you can see that it's going to grow, from 10 billion to at least, 12 billion by 2023. So that's only within the next 2 years. And when we draw the story about, let's say, Asia Pacific in general, what you can see is that, the alternative protein market is actually growing faster in China and also in Asia Pacific in comparison to the Western world. So when we think about impact, it's always important to assess which companies are going to be supplying this region. And of course, you can support international companies to expand in Asia, but why not just support Asian companies as well to be able to capture the market on their own? And in terms of the investment landscape, honestly, when I started off in this space in 2018, especially in Asia, there were only a handful of players. And now it's so difficult, to choose companies because we have so many options. And what's interesting as well is the segmentation. So I think when we started off in this space, especially in 2018, this is when it was getting hot. The only companies that you could find in the market were probably, let's say, plant-based meat companies. Now you can see the, very specific segmentation on, let's say, plant-based chicken, plant-based, poultry. It might be different types of, let's say, red meat from beef, from lamb, to, let's say, steaks, to minced formats. It's quite diverse. And even when it comes to, let's say, cooking aids, you can see the rise of the dairy category and all its different segmentations, including eggs that can then be used in, let's say, the cooking and the cooking segment. And then, I would say from 2019 onwards, you could see the rise of cell-based companies in this region. So the cell-based companies, this is more of a biotechnology play, where they want to recreate animal products, not, let's say, change plant products to make them look like animal products, but rather just create animal products through biotechnology. So that can be done through, stem cell technology. It can be used through fermentation-based technology, or even genetically modifying let's say, microbes to produce animal proteins. So this is now, let's say, the new movement that's happening. And luckily, there are so many different companies to choose from. When we try to assess, let's say, the success of companies entering the market, so of course, all of these young companies, they need initial investment to grow. And this was the story, of course, of very successful companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible, right? So both of these companies required initial investment to be able to reach the scale that they are at today. So what we can see, like from, let's say, the investment landscape, is the majority of funding is always going to come from the venture capitalists. Following that, you'll have the corporate venture capital arm. So the corporate venture capital arm will be from, let's say, a food company. So it might be the Tyson Ventures that will then be, let's say, inputting money or stimulating the sector. Following that, you'll have, let's say, private investors, either family offices, so like large wealthy groups, or angel investors, so like small individual investors. And then you have a next section, which would be, let's say, the incubator. So the incubator is the first, let's say, model that really supports the commercialization of research and technology. And then last but not least, the funding will come from the government and universities. So what we always say is that when you look at this figure, actually there's a huge responsibility on the venture capitalists, because we're essentially, backing up the best, we're backing up the talent that's going to become mainstream in the future. So, and at the same time, when we show this figure, what we always tell government and policymakers is that they need to invest more. It can't just rely on private capital from venture capital firms. And, unfortunately, we live in a world where not all venture capitalists might be aligned when it comes to, sustainability, when it comes to, let's say, assessing the right technology or even backing the right founders. And, this is something I always like to talk about as well, since we're on like a global platform, is for the food technology segment, less than 3% of funding goes to women and less than 1% goes to women of color. So this really shows what kind of companies we're growing for the future. So, it's very important that we are vocal about this. And, luckily at Big Idea Ventures, we are very aware of these statistics and proud to say that over 50% of our portfolio are founded or co-founded by women. And at least, 50% are people of color. So, there has to be a very strong emphasis on, who's backing who. And what can we do to reassure and push government policymakers to incubate and really make sure that the right companies are coming to light? So, going back to like some of the opportunities, what we can see is that at least in the plant-based space, a lot of money has been injected into this ecosystem. You can see that only within the last 2 years, according to the 2020 Traction report, almost $1 billion, US dollars were pumped into at least 100 companies, or almost 100 companies. For the biotechnology space, it's a bit less, but I think from our perspective as a venture capital in this field, we're going to see that change because there's becoming a saturation in the market right now for plant-based companies. But it's also good to see that within the Asian market, actually there are some great companies that are, let's say, receiving notable investments. So I just want to highlight 2 companies here on this list. So the company which received, let's say, quite a high investment in the innovative, let's say, cell-based space was actually a Singaporean company called Shiok Meats. They've actually raised over 30 million US dollars to date. So, just to show you that there are great talents of deep technology, let's say, investments, deep technology solutions within this region. Another example would be Integriculture, which was a company from Japan that's also working on the cell-based space, producing all types of, let's say, meats, biomaterials to really support that ecosystem. So, it's something that, I guess, like, the people, investors, and as well as, innovators should be aware of that, funding is going everywhere. And there are great opportunities for you to be an Asian innovator as well. And, kind of doing a macro lens again on the Asia Pacific market, I think last year, especially as we mentioned, with the supply chain disruptions because of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of money was also injected into this sector. So in Asia Pacific, according to the Green Queen Media and Future Food Now report, they showed that, if you just looked at 2020 versus the last 3 years, there was over 350% increase in funding. In the alternative protein segment, which is really exciting. So like a lot of local companies, from all the way from, let's say, China, Japan to Australia, all receive sufficient amount of funding. And, in terms of the categories, of course, plant-based received the majority of that funding, followed by cell-based and fermentation. Our predictions for the future, don't quote me on it, is going to change next year. I do believe that biotechnology and fermentation and cell-based is going to gain a larger chunk of the investment size, just because the market is becoming quite saturated at the moment. Just to kind of give you an example of some of the companies that are like out there, and also just to highlight, a bit of our portfolio. I just want to talk about some of the key players in the region that are, let's say, quite early in terms of their size, but we should see in maybe the next 2 to 3 years these products becoming more mainstream. So Evo is a company from India that is specializing with plant-based eggs. What they want to do, of course, is to be able to tap on the largest markets in the world, the Indian market, that have, let's say, a very long tradition of, let's say, of veganism, either through vegetarianism or Hinduism or even, Jainism. So this is, an example of how, these innovations are going into different markets. You have Gen Meats in China that were producing a combination of different plant proteins to develop, plant-based beef. And they've recreated this into very interesting, let's say, prototypes. So they've done mooncakes, with their meat mince. They've also done, burgers. They've done meatballs. And this is something really just to show that, this movement is really taking off everywhere. In Singapore, we have a company called Karana, which is using, let's say, the whole food segment, and they're specializing on jackfruit to develop a minced meat-like, format that can then be added into, all types of products as a minced, let's say, topping, as dumpling, as baos. And this is, interesting because, for them, it was about having a single ingredient rather than a combination of different plant proteins. You also have companies from the Philippines. So WTH, or Worth the Health Foods, their emphasis was on combining different healthy foods that were indigenous to the Filipino market, such as mung beans and jackfruit, and recreating Filipino dishes. So this is interesting because you can see now in Asia, it's not just about creating the burgers, but it's really about creating foods that Asians love and that local communities love. And so like adding the right flavor profiles, making sure that it can be reincorporated into traditional dishes is becoming very important. The next company I'm going to highlight as well is Future. So this is another interesting case study because, for this company, they're founded in Malaysia. They have operations in Singapore as well as Thailand and Hong Kong. And they are one of the first companies to have the halal certification. So halal certification, of course, is very important for this region because you can capture a very large market segment, especially within Muslim communities like in Indonesia, where the Muslim market is expected to grow to actually the largest Muslim, let's say, majority population in the world by 2030. So, for them to have that vision to become the first halal certified was really quite smart because they were able to access so many different markets quite quickly. And of course, enter into the Middle East next and other, let's say, European or US markets with that certification standard. So you can really see that, to become more mainstream, you also need to think outside the box and get specific labels. Another interesting company from Singapore is Gaia Foods. So Gaia Foods was the first cell-based red meat company that emerged back in 2020. And what they wanted to show is that they could create these very thin constructs of beef, and really that that could be added to Asian dishes, either as again like sliced pieces, like to your pho's or stir fries, but also then moving towards some of the meat chunks. So unlike the West, where they like to have these very big slabs of meat, either like in the breast or a cutlet form, in Asia, they do like to have smaller bite-sized chunks. So companies are looking for ways to also localize that, and not only in the plant-based segment, but also by using cellular agriculture. And a funny story about Gaia Foods is they recently got acquired by another one of our portfolio companies, Shiok Meats. So as I mentioned, Shiok Meats is one of the most famous companies in this region, really the pioneers in the cell-based space for creating the world's first cell-based crustacean, focusing on shrimp, crabs, and lobsters. So, you can really see now what's happening is there's a consolidation in the market where a lot of, of these bigger companies want to also join forces with smaller biotechnology or cell-based companies to be able to really, make an impact and to really add value together, combining their technologies and technical know-how. And again, these are there are a lot of great examples in this region. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can really see that, from North to Southeast Asia to the Pacific to South Asia, there's so many different, let's say, opportunities in the investment space and different stages, of course, in terms of funding. So, if you are interested in investing, I would definitely recommend, reading up about it and learning more about some of these opportunities. And, again, when it comes to, let's say, agri-tech focused investors, we are, let's say, lucky in Asia Pacific, especially where we have many of these firms available that can also fund very different stages of companies' developments. And just to show that, some of these companies, they will invest, of course, in local, Asian alternative protein companies, but some of them are also investing in international players. So an interesting one to assess as well is Murray Asset. So Murray Asset is a South Korean investment firm that were actually the lead investors for the Impossible Foods Series F round. So it really just comes to show that Asian investors, as well as the innovators, are really thinking globally and thinking of ways of how they can really, support this ecosystem. Another great example is Otsuka Pharmaceuticals, which is a Japanese company. And again, it's about the crossovers. So as a pharmaceutical company, they wanted to expand their portfolio to have, some of the plant-based companies join and to really give the sort of the health and wellness, let's say, push for this segment. So they actually acquired Canada's Daya Foods. So that's actually owned by Otsuka Pharmaceuticals. And through that, let's say, acquisition, what you saw is Daya took off all over the world. They were able to really expand globally and expand into the Asia Pacific market, especially. All right, so now that you have like a good, let's say, awareness about like, the trends as well as the investment opportunities, I'm going to tell you a bit about like what are the opportunities, like what do companies need to think about when they're entering the Asia market. From here, we'll also dive a bit deeper into some of the nutritional and formulation challenges. So for a lot of companies, of course, when they are recreating these alternative protein ideas, they're going to, of course, be able to develop them on a lab scale. So like a very small scale production. This is not enough because we want to see how these products can become mainstream. So we need to do a validation from the pilot scale to the co-manufacturing scale to see how they will, let's say, fare in front of the consumers, which is like the final stage. Luckily in Singapore, we're very blessed, and as well as other regions in Asia as well, to have a lot of these facilities that will enable innovators to move from that lab scale all the way to the pilot and commercial scales. So just to give you a few examples of what's available in Singapore, we have innovation centers that are led by the government that can support these companies to validate their ideas, secure intellectual property, and do pilot scale production. That they can tap onto resources such as A-STAR, which is the institution which is for the advancement of science, technology, and applied research. So this is like one example. We also have corporations now that are opening up innovation centers that anyone can rent out and do validation trials or R&D support. You have the Buehler Givaudan Innovation Center, which actually supports extrusion technologies. So extrusion is the technology that's applied to basically change the structure of plant-based products and make them more fibrous, similar to meat. So this innovation center would like help companies assess what type of plant proteins to combine with the right conditions to create the optimal product. Another example is Wilmar, which is a traditional, let's say, soy company, in the sense that they are responsible for ingredient sourcing and sorting, as well as producing the high value products such as the concentrates and isolates. They've also developed a pilot plant facility where companies can also innovate and do research and hopefully commercially scale these technologies. And last but not least, you also have the JTC, Sunoco, and Growthwell collaboration. And this is a combination of, let's say, industrial energy companies, as well as locally homegrown plant-based innovators that are now developing a plug-and-play system where anyone can just tap onto these factories and facilities and really produce their products at scale. So it's quite exciting. You can really see that within Singapore, And the way Singapore is positioning itself, they really are trying to be the food tech hub, or they are, not trying, they are now the food tech hub of the region. And they are attracting, not only local and regional talent, but also international talent to the area. So I'm gonna tell you a nice story about a company called NextGen. So NextGen were actually founded by two gentlemen, one of them from Germany, who was actually part of a plant-based German company called Like Meat. Like Meat was, acquired by Live Kindly, which is from an investment firm called Blue Horizon. So, after he sold the company, he wanted to go on a new adventure, and he moved over to Asia. In Singapore, he met his co-founder, who was the product manager for Sats Food. So Sats Food is a pilot plant facility. It's a production plant for food, for all types of food in Singapore. He resigned from his job and joined forces with this guy, and they started up their new company called NextGen, incorporated in Singapore, to develop plant-based chicken meat alternatives. They actually raised one of the largest seed rounds in history for this segment. They raised up to $10 million for their seed round. And this is only within, I would say in less than 2 years since the German company was acquired. So you can really see a lot of innovation. You can see that there are many opportunities for not only local players, but also for international players to move over to Singapore and really make a difference. And the reason for this as well is that Singapore, as well as in Asia, in comparison to some of the, let's say, the food regulatory authorities such as the FDA or even the European Food Safety Authority, they have a very streamlined process, and they have a lot of, let's say, push towards making sure that they can apply very, let's say, novel food applications in a relatively short time. So what you can see that what has happened is actually Singapore was the world's first country to approve the commercial sale of cultured meat or cell-based meat. This was approved back in December 2020, where Eat Just was able to debut their cell-based chicken in a restaurant here in Singapore. And they've also launched through food delivery, through Food Panda as well, I think in the last few months. So to be able to do this, of course, there was a lot of support from, let's say, the regulatory authorities, from government think tanks. They had to do also R&D work in local institutions here in Singapore to show that their products could pass all of the food safety and regulatory aspects. So, but it's quite an exciting journey, of course, because there's a lot of opportunity now for other cell-based companies from around the world, as well as the ones that are regionally based in Asia, to now do a launch in Singapore. I know that the next country in the world that announced, let's say, the plans to commercialize cell-based meat is Qatar in the Arabian Gulf. So you can see that Singapore being the pioneer have inspired other small countries around the world, that for them to be able to reach food, let's say, security and food self-sufficiency, they need to go down this route as well. Let me go to the next slide. Sorry. So yeah, in general, even though we're painting quite a nice picture for you to enter the Asian market with some of these innovative technologies, it's not that clear or straightforward, because there still requires a lot of education, especially on the consumer side, to be able to assess if these products, will be accepted, right? So there's still a lot of confusion. There's a lot of, let's say, there are a lot of questions about the supply chain with the cell cultured products. There's also the concerns around the health, if these are more nutritious foods in comparison to plant-based or even animal products. There's also the sustainability component when you look at some of the plant-based foods with regards to monocropping. So should we consume more soy-based products? Is there a way for us to diversify that as well? So I think luckily in Asia, we have a lot of, let's say, think tanks and awareness about this movement, but there still requires a bit of time for us to really assess if these technologies can get into the market and how they'll fare in terms of their sustainability imprint, as well as price points and many other factors. But having said that, of course, Asia is a relatively easy market to enter with an alternative protein product because of religious reasons, as we've mentioned, because of the health, let's say, awareness, and let's say the rise of chronic diseases, and last but not least, the sustainability and the conscious consumerism, which are supporting more sustainable food practices. So some of the challenges, of course, also lie back on the supply chain issues. And something I want to note as well, and this is probably what a lot of consumers are asking nowadays, is, why are plant-based or alternative protein products so expensive? Right? So like it's a very similar story to the organic foods movement. Why are they so premium? And the reason for this is there's exponential costs that are unfortunately being borne down to the consumer. And the reason for that is, in terms of it, let's say the full supply chain, in terms of sourcing the raw material to the production facilities, as well as the transportation and distribution, there just aren't enough players that are willing to do alternative protein. So when you think about, let's say from a co-manufacturing point of view, a lot of these manufacturing facilities do not have the facilities that are, let's say, trace-free of like animal and dairy products. They're not trace-free from allergens. So there needs to be a lot of, let's say, work to be able to make sure that they have those policies in place. And not just that, that they have the right equipment as well. So as we've mentioned, a lot of the equipment is still new, is still undergoing R&D, and is very expensive. So, unfortunately, this is something that needs to be improved upon to make these products more mainstream and affordable. Luckily, of course, we are getting a lot of support in Singapore, especially in terms of investing in this ecosystem. But, I think something which we all talk about is the subsidies, right? So like the traditional, let's say, animal meat sector has a lot of subsidies, including other, let's say, agricultural commodities. So we always wonder, will the alternative protein ecosystem also be subsidized? And hopefully that will bring the price points down eventually. So yeah, talking about, of course, price points, you also have, food safety. That will then, of course, fall down again to, let's say, the sourcing. And, even with plants, of course, you can still get issues. So, especially with plants, what we would always, classify is the rise of aflatoxins. So I'm sure, you're going to have a talk about this later during the forum, but, with regards to, let's say, rising temperatures around the world, with regards to, let's say, adequate, storage, transportation of grains, if they're not stored properly, or if they get, let's say, overexposure to humidity and high temperatures, they can, let's say, the natural, let's say, fungus that will grow on them will be able to develop, let's say, aflatoxins. And unfortunately, aflatoxins cannot be washed away. They cannot be, cooked. They're heat stable, and they are hepatotoxic, which means that they are toxic for your liver and can lead to very, let's say, chronic illnesses if they're consumed on a frequent basis. So with a lot of these plant-based foods, something that we need to be reassured about is that the ingredient sourcers are doing the right type of let's say, grain sorting to make sure that they're able to eliminate these, let's say, highly contaminated grains. And at the same time, let's say farmers can also get the right support so that they can have, good yields and non-contaminated crops. Other issues, of course, is like the GM concerns. So, there are a lot of, let's say, countries in the world, especially here in Asia Pacific, that, that don't accept, let's say, genetically modified foods, especially in China. But, what I would always mention is, with genetic modified, let's say, anything, microorganisms or foods, we can improve efficiency and sustainability. And that's how we're developing some of these very advanced biotechnology-based, cell-based, or even fermentation-based foods. So we still need to have a stronger, let's say, regulatory body that is able to differentiate between, let's say, adequate genetically modified foods and inadequate ones that might be detrimental to the environment and our health, and the ones that are actually supporting efficiency and sustainability. So yeah, I'm just going to move on quickly because I know I'm running out of time. But what I wanted to touch on as well is some of the challenges that we're facing is also supply chains. So not only by the COVID-19 pandemic, we're also food commodities are also being disrupted by government policies. So the trade wars between China and the U.S. has also disrupted, for instance, soy prices and other types of innovative grains. What you can see as a result of that is different countries around the world have taken the opportunity to become, let's say, the major exporters to the Asia market. So you have, the Brazilian government received a lot of funding from China to be able to supply, soy for those markets. And you also have, Australia and Canada also pumping a lot of, stimulus into their own agricultural industries to be able to provide more exports for the Asian market. So, now that I've kind of given you a bit about the challenges for the Asian market and some of the like some of the challenges as well as the opportunities for entering, I'll talk to you a bit about some of the dynamic categories, what we're seeing in this space, and then just touch a bit lightly on the nutritional profile. So for the categories, what you'll tend to see is there will be, let's say, the plant-based, the cell-based, and then you'll often be hearing about fermentation. So just to kind of break it down as simple as possible, with the plant-based products, these are like usually sourced from, again, from grains that we commonly see. They might also come from different microorganisms, such as, fungi, microalgae. They'll go through different types of, processing technologies to develop a wider range of products. Similar to cell-based technologies, but rather, of course, they will be using cell lines instead of like, plants or microorganisms. They'll be using, different biomaterials, bioreagents, and equipment to also be producing different types of, products. With fermentation, what you're seeing is a combination of both. So fermentation will use the feedstock, which might come from plant sources. The microorganisms will then ferment the feedstock. So they might be, again, like fungal, they might be, yeast, they might be bacteria, they might even be microalgae. And through sort of the similar cell-based processes, through putting them in an incubator or bioreactor, you're then able to extract the biomass, which can then be restructured into different types of products. You also have like the more genetically modified fermentation techniques, which will, let's say, genetically engineer microorganisms to produce, let's say, animal cell lines, and then extract them and then develop them into different products. So this is some of the examples of the technologies that you'll see around. I'll skip this slide, but this is more to do with like some of the processing methods and how they've innovated throughout the years, and how we've moved from, let's say, the mock meats and tofu to some of the more minced meat and patties using extrusion and 3D printing. And again, you can see that a lot of innovations in this space have shown, from the traditional mock meat, which was, uniform in color. It cooked, the same, when you cooked it, it was the same color. But now you can see a lot of innovation where, they want to recreate the pinkish, and how that, product browns after cooking to really give you a more realistic meat feel. And one thing to also note, tapping onto the whole food segment, is now you can see like the movement into sort of elevated vegan foods. So, for instance, Karana, what you can see is they've taken, the simple, jackfruit and shown how they can reinvent it into baos and dumplings. And with tempeh, you can see another one of our portfolio companies, Angie's Tempeh, have showed how they can just totally transform tempeh from its let's say humble forms as a really nutritious block to actually like bakwa, which is like a beef or pork jerky that can be found in Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of room for us to innovate and recreate. And I think in Asia we should never underestimate the talent and really the creative minds that are really developing amazing products. So I'm just going to touch on lightly some of the nutritional, let's say, deficits and how we can improve them in the future. Because I'm sure you're all wondering, are these products more nutritionally beneficial for me? Should I be consuming them on a regular basis? So, I'll just kind of, give you a few examples. So, when it comes to at least the plant-based foods, what we're seeing, of course, is, a lot of the, let's say, the side streams and like the isolates and fractionates that we're extracting from them, they were traditionally used as animal feed or fuel or even like food additives, but now they're being used for alternative protein. And we have like very sophisticated methods, of course, to be able to enhance them, to make them concentrated, to remove some of the bad, let's say, bitter notes, which can be like a result of some of the polyphenols. We can also defat them, so they're very like pure protein concentrates. And then this is what we use for, let's say, the plant-based meat products. Yeah. And in terms of their application, of course, it's great because they can be used in so many different ways as emulsifiers, stabilizers, texturizers. So they can be used essentially as ingredients for everything, not only plant-based meat. And of course, they have really great properties, especially when it comes to the water holding capacity. So that's the ability to retain moisture. It's also in terms of like the oil holding capacity when it comes to like an emulsion. So especially if it's a dressing. Then you have like the foaming, which is very important for like a scrambled egg, where you want it to be light and fluffy. And then you even have gelation, which will be like important for some of these like puddings or dairy products as well. So, having said that, of course, one thing that I will always, tell, let's say, food producers to keep in mind, especially to some of our companies, when they're trying to assess and choose what kind of protein isolate they should use. So there are ways to assess nutritional quality by looking at the digestibility score. So that's how well do humans digest it and absorb the nutrition. So luckily, we do have a lot of, let's say, data out there with regards to different protein sources. And as a matter of fact, as humans, we can absorb protein more sufficiently from animals. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's just the way the score is. That's just the way that we're built, right? So what we want to do, of course, is make sure that we are consuming protein sources that have a very high score, that are similar to the animal products. So when we look at different sources, legumes, especially soy, is quite high, and that's why it's been a very popular, nutritious protein source. You have pea protein, which is, okay, it's also quite good. But when you look at some of the cereals, especially oat, wheat, barley, and many others, they will usually have the lowest score in terms of the digestibility score. But what you're seeing, which is quite interesting, is actually when you look at the way that you process these protein sources and the way you extract them, you can actually change the digestibility score as well. So like one of our companies from India is actually doing fermentation techniques on millets. So this is like a cereal. And through this, they're able to increase the digestibility score from a cereal grade all the way to a legume grade. So there are a lot of innovations. I think it's very important for food producers to really, tap into some of these innovations and find ways to constantly improve the digestibility score. So, what you'll often see as well is a lot of companies will mix and match different protein sources so that they can get a more optimal nutrition. And this is like a great chart as well to show you an example from like the three categories, as I mentioned, the soy, other legumes, and cereals. And how we would assess them in terms of the allergenicity. It might also be the amino acid profile, which will be varied as well depending on different protein sources. And again, because they're varied, that also emphasizes why a lot of food producers will mix them together. The other thing, of course, is you have different taste profiles. So usually when there's like a bad taste, we'll have bitter blockers or other additives or enhancers to improve the taste profile. And in terms of the functional properties, so how they behave in the foods, like I said, the emulsifying, the foaming, the solubility, we can also assess that as well and make sure that we choose the right ones. So in general, what I always want to encourage is that you should like be able to understand like why it's important to consume a very, let's say, balanced diet, to have many different protein sources. Especially if you are going on a vegan diet, make sure that you can combine different types from like the soy, cereals, the legumes and the cereal categories. And at the same time, if you can read up about it, try to read more about the advancements in improving the digestibility scores as well. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there and just kind of give you a summary of what we've talked about. So I really hope that you've enjoyed listening about all the different opportunities, from the investment opportunities to the supply chain concerns of like entering the Asia market, and last but not least, how to really capture the right functional properties and also the nutritional profile of alternative proteins, and how all together with all these different ecosystem players, as well as amazing think tank groups like the Plant Fit Asia Summit, by putting all of these great minds together, this is how we can truly bring more alternative protein products to the mainstream that are affordable and equally fully functional and nutritious for us. So thank you so much. Please follow us on on our website and other social media platforms, and we're very excited to get to know you more during this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dalal. That was really fascinating. A lot of really interesting information covered there. So we actually have time for, I'd say, one or two questions. I actually wanted to ask you, you said since 2018, when the space really started to heat up, the alternative protein space, you've seen it grow from only a handful of companies to now being quite challenging for you to choose who to take on board. So, I mean, this is fantastic news, but I was curious to know, how do you make your decision today? What are the key factors that you look into?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think, for us, there isn't, let's say, one size fits all. Like we don't have a cookie cutter model of what we're looking for. But, typically what we would try to do is, from our, let's say our investment, let's say insights, especially, as we're seeing a rise towards, fermentation and biotechnology, as well as some of the trends in different markets, we will always try to invest in the, let's say, the first movers within that region. So just to give you an example, so like, when you look at, let's say the Indian market or even the Asia Pacific market, there aren't that many, let's say, fermentation companies that focus on developing, dairy analogs, using genetically engineered microbes. So that might be like one example where we just focus on the innovation. There might be other examples where they have the first mover advantage in the sense that they're going to expand and enter into the market at a very quick pace. So that, that's a way for us to also see that they finished their product, they have a great, branding, and let's say a category play, and they have a right sort of, organizational and structural management to really probably like, let's say execute this project. So, we always will try to, let's say make a fine balance between innovation, the team capabilities, and their progress. But yes, it's becoming increasingly challenging because there are so many great companies in Asia now.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Dalal. I'll just I have a lot of questions, but only time for one. I think I'm going to touch on the halal certification, which you mentioned earlier from the company Future Foods in Malaysia. I think this is actually very interesting because I've actually spoken to people who would not consume a plant-based protein product with the word pork in it, which is interesting because for so many reasons. So how do you see the halal? I mean, how many options? I don't think there are that many halal certified plant-based proteins at the moment, but how do you see this growing in the future in this region?
Yeah, and that's something that's really interesting for us as well. I think especially with the example of Future. So when they started off their product pipeline, they focused on pork. But because of, let's say, the regulatory policies, they had to drop the word pork because it wasn't compatible with halal. So they had to change it to meat. So everything is called Future Meat now. But of course, like essentially it is halal because they go through all the right standards. But in order to get that certification, they just had to drop the name. I think for the halal industry, what's interesting, and this is something that we're doing at Big Idea Ventures, is assessing for some of the new technologies. So for instance, the cell-based, the fermentation-based technologies, how can we support new, let's say, regulations to be formed for halal to be applied to them as well. And it's really promising because actually they're already starting. A lot of the think tanks, especially in Asia Pacific, because what you have to understand is there are at least 40 different halal certifying bodies worldwide. So it's a total mess. so like each country has to obtain the one within their market, and they might have very different rules and regulations. But in general, I think what you're seeing is they really do want to capture this market. They want to find ways to be able to marry both the halal trends and the plant-based trends. Of course, there are so many synergies, especially when it comes to quality assurance, traceability, and it's relatively straightforward. But there needs to be more education and awareness. So I think a lot of companies will have to be sensitive with their, let's say, nomenclature, the words that they use. Another one of our companies, the meatballs that was coming up on my presentation, is Veef from the UK, from Australia, and they also have a halal certification. So what happened to them is they had a product called Bacon Bits, and they had to drop bacon for the Singapore market, and they had to change it into meat bits for the halal certification. So yeah, there's ways to go around it, but yeah, absolutely, we're all learning together how best to navigate these waters.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, I am excited to see this space continue to grow. as you projected earlier. So Dr. Dalal, I want to thank you so much for taking the time with a fantastic presentation, and looking forward to seeing all the fantastic brands coming up from Big Idea Ventures in the future, and all the best going forward. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, thanks to everyone for listening. Take care.